I'm Becky. I am a short 26-year-old with short hair and glasses. So yeah, my presentation is sort of looking at my PhD work and also the exhibition I did for the Barber, which was very closely tied to my PhD work as well. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about both of those things together, because I can't really separate them, to be honest. Then I'm going to want to talk about the emergence of sound studies, which is my sort of methodological approach to my work and to the exhibition as well. Then sort of more generally speaking, I want to talk to you about sound studies and art history, and then thinking about sound and art in the past. So my particular focus is in 18th century studies, but sound and art goes back way further than that. And then I also want to talk to you about sound and art now in a museum context as well. So my thesis is quite a big thing to kind of discuss in a short space of time. But basically, I want to think about how images sort of make us think about sound. In particular, sort of my terminology I use is implied sound, because obviously it is a mute image. There is no sound involved, but sound is evoked by the artist creating these works. So that is the long and short of it, what my work looks at. Obviously, you know, sort of saying, there's implied sound in this image sounds noisy, is all very well and good. But what I really want is to question what these sounds mean, what they reveal, what they tell us. It's that stuff that I'm really interested in. So I think about how implied sound opens up these images to a sense of time and transience. I focus my thesis on 18th century landscapes, which are sort of typically considered very static. They're unchanging, and this is sort of what the artist wants us to think. You know, these are ideal pastoral landscapes that you have no noise in them whatsoever. My thesis is trying to challenge that. I'm trying to think about how implied sound makes us think about what might have happened before this image, what might happen afterwards. And how it challenges this idea of an unchanging landscape. Sound as well has this incredible power to change the way we think and feel about artworks as well. I'm really interested in how sort of looking at a scene of peace and quiet might initially sort of make us think, you know, oh, this is lovely, peace and quiet, pastoral, we go to the landscape to escape the noise of the city. But in actuality, and what I found in my research, is that often peace and quiet is and can be very tense. This doesn't necessarily have to be a positive sort of sonic environment. It can be tense, it can be challenging, especially when it's people of different classes interacting and bringing this idea of silence into a scene. It's actually, the more you kind of think about it, it becomes really, I don't know, uncomfortable to kind of look at. And then, sort of more generally speaking, I want to think about how thinking about implied sound in artworks opens up these images to a wider non-specialist audience. As we were saying with this morning's sessions, thinking about the senses in art is something that people can really connect to and think about and makes them, I don't know, engages them in the artwork more than maybe just thinking about the purely visual. So that's a massive part of sort of what I want my research to do. For people. So these are just a selection of some of the images from the exhibition upstairs. I knew I wanted to include the Hogarth scene, the four times of day sequence, because Hogarth's, I mean, he's a little bit early for me, actually, in my research, but his ability to kind of create hyperbolic gestures and facial expressions is so good at implying and evoking noise, especially noisy bodies and people. And also they're great fun to look at, and Hogarth scenes are never quiet, they're always insanely noisy, and there's always crazy things going on, which makes them, you know, they're fun to look at as well. Other scenes I chose just to sort of explain to the viewer about soundscapes and how soundscapes work, and sort of how I think about them in my art. The hunting scene by John Leach I wanted to include because hunting is sort of a massive part of soundscapes, and especially British soundscapes in the 18th and early 19th centuries. But again, it's challenging this idea of peace and quiet. The British landscape is an ideally a peaceful and quiet one. But then we bring in hunting, which is a massive part of that landscape. Well, hunting's noisy. So how do we connect this idea of peace and quiet and noisy hunting? How does this work? And often it's class related and sort of who is allowed to create noise in this soundscape and who isn't. And then obviously the Turner image of the Lake of Thun was really good for sort of thinking about sublime sounds. The sublime, which is that which inspires both fear and awe in equal measure. Edmund Burke. Burke actually writes in his inquiry into the sublime and the beautiful that the eye is not the only organ of sensation. So people in the 18th century are thinking about the sublime and these kind of huge kind of aesthetic theories in terms of the multisensory. This is by no means sort of new by any stretch of the imagination. The aims of the display that I really wanted to sort of get across was to encourage a multisensory way of looking, which the Barber was already doing with the scent exhibition that you've all seen and sort of heard about this morning. So from my perspective, I was like, this is really good. We're going to, this will allow us to build on this multisensory idea. And then I wanted to provide a lens through which the public could understand both the images and also the historical past as being audibly diverse. I think a lot of people, history is this very distant thing, and thinking about it in the multisensory makes it seem a little bit closer. It's something we can, relate to. We've all been in noisy situations. We've all been in London in Covent Garden, and it's been really noisy because it's Covent Garden in London. So it's encouraging them to think of the past as being sonically diverse, but also encouraging the viewer to think about how we consider sound today. I think sound is a massively overlooked part of our culture. We live in a very visual society. So I think sort of encouraging people to think about sound is quite important and something that maybe people don't necessarily do very much. And finally, I think this kind of multisensory way of looking encourages viewers to create personal and really imaginative responses to the images. I've already had people ask me and get asked quite a lot, like, how would you incorporate actual soundscapes into your, your ideas and your displays and things? And the answer to that is long and complicated, and something I will touch on sort of later. But sort of the way I came into soundscapes and thinking about these images through implied sound was purely based on my imagination. And I think as a way to sort of start people thinking about this, I think that has some benefits as well as some drawbacks. So now to talk to you about sound studies, which is the form, like the magic behind my display and my work as a whole. I now think of myself as an art historian first and a sound study historian second, though sometimes that changes round in order, to be honest. As an academic discipline, sound studies emerges in the 1970s with the work of a Canadian called R. Murray Schafer. And he basically comes up with the whole idea. We still use most of his definitions. He's a crucial figure for me in my work. So sound students, which is what we're sort of referred to as, are people who consider sound. It's not just sort of recording of sound, which is what a lot of sound students do and something I would be very interested in doing in the future. But we also think about the historical aspects of sound. And it's niche, but becoming more popular. So people think about sounds in sort of medieval Europe, all the way up until sort of contemporary modern day life as well. It's not only thinking about the sounds produced, it's thinking about the sound producer. So who's making these sounds? How are they reacting to these sounds? How do they impact the landscape they are a part of? All of these things, it's hugely multifaceted. There's a lot of places it can take you as a subject. And sort of more recently, and I think my work tries to look at this as well, is less about value judgments on whether a sound is good or bad. A lot of early sound studies work are like, noise, that's bad. It's urban, you can't hear anything, it's so noisy. Which I think is interesting in and of itself, but I'm less sort of concerned with those kind of judgments in my work. I'm more thinking about, oh, you're interpreting this as noise. Why are you interpreting this as noise? Noise is a massively subjective thing. And again, could just be a study in and of itself, to be honest. So, soundscapes. This is the formula behind my work, my exhibition, my general way of thinking. It's a term from Schaeffer, and the soundscape is the sonic environment. It works in the same way as a landscape, but sort of the audible equivalent of. And Schaeffer says it's broken down into sort of 3 coherent and interchangeable parts. So the keynote, which is it's an underlying background sound. Traffic would be a good example. It's not necessarily listened to sort of consciously, but it impacts how we hear other sounds in this environment. We then move on to this idea of the signal sound. This is typically more often human-generated. So a siren is a prime example of this. We hear it, we know it's telling us to get out of the way or alerting us to something. It's imparting information to us. And then finally, and to me most interestingly, we have the sound mark. This is a sound that belongs to a particular community and holds specific meaning to those within that community. So we are currently at the University of Birmingham. The chimes of the Old Joe Clock Tower, which if I'd timed this better, we could hear, is an example of a sound mark. And then finally, the point of audition, this isn't actually a term that Schaeffer uses, it's actually a term from film studies. It works in the same way as a point of view, but it's someone who we can choose to listen on our behalf. So in the detail from the enraged musician, there are, in loads of Hogarths, there's numerous points of audition figures we can use, but if we were to use the enraged musician, we can tell that he's finding the noise outside his window to be very distracting, and he's so angry, bless him. But simultaneously, if we were to choose the sort of oboist figure, he isn't particularly bothered by the sort of annoyance he's causing, and he's actually listening to his own music that he's making. So there's a question between sort of noise and music and class. The sort of professional musician is annoyed by the music that is happening outside his window because that music is being produced by someone of a lower class than him. These are the kind of ideas I'm sort of dealing with in my work. So, sound studies and art history. There's not a great deal sort of being done on it currently, which is great for me. I love being niche. There are often sort of chapters in books and things, but no sort of overall work. And there's lots of different sort of ideas and time frames being looked at. There's some stuff on sort of Dutch landscapes and how sort of the introduction of musical instruments makes us think about time, as I sort of mentioned at the beginning. The image I've chosen here by Nicholas Mays, The Eavesdropper, is a really interesting one because it's making us as the viewer complicit in an act of surreptitious listening. So we're sort of being drawn in by this maid who's shushing us. She's overhearing something. So in this image, sound is a massive part of it, and you can't really escape that. There are other examples as well. I'm really interested in sort of colonized landscapes and the soundscapes associated with colonized land. So Peter Denny wrote about the colonized soundscape of Australia and sort of the strange and what would have been to the colonizers alien sounds of that landscape as sort of being terrifying, but also being needed to be subdued. These sounds of otherness need to be silenced and replaced by more familiar sounds that you would have heard in somewhere like London. And also John Barrell, who's a massive sort of influence on my work. He's also looked at sort of British 18th century conversation pieces, which, as he points out, despite their titles, are strangely mute. These people do not seem to be having any kind of conversation, which is a bit weird. So yeah, there's stuff being written, but nowhere near, to my mind, what deserves to be sort of written on the subject, which is so vast, and sometimes I give myself a headache thinking about it. But sound and art, sort of historically, how have people thought about it? No, it is not by any stretch of the imagination a new thing. Art critics, theorists, philosophers have been interested in sound, in art, for centuries. So the Greek, and the earliest one I can find is the Greek philosopher Philostratus. In his text Imagines, he writes about art and is really interested in the mimetic qualities of art and how much art resembles its real life counterpart. And he sort of writes in his book, he's like, oh wow, in this painting of swans, you can absolutely hear the swans, look at the swans, hear the swans. And he does this loads. He doesn't really explore that much deeper than that, but he's making that connection. He's like, this art looks like the thing it is, therefore I can imagine it, and I can imagine what it sounds like. Good old Diderot, of course, he has something to say on this. In sort of his text on the salons in the 1760s, he writes that sort of particularly skilled artists have this ability to create very lifelike works of art that prompt us to think about the sounds associated with them, especially sort of art. He uses one example, Philippe Jacques de Lauterbourg, who was painting in the French academies at this time, and he writes about one particular artwork. I think it was the first one that he had on display at the salons. It's a scene of sort of a pastoral scene, shepherds, and the shepherds playing a little flute, and there are some goats and stuff, and he's like, you can imagine the sounds of the flute and the lowing of the herd and things, and isn't this pastoral and lovely? Again, he goes no deeper than that. He's just like, you can hear it. And similarly, Carl Gustav Carus in his 9 letters on landscape painting notes sort of in a particular image. I always think of like Ruysdael's when I read this, painting of like a waterfall or a stream. He says one can hear the very rushings of the waters. So it has this believability. This art is so realistic, you can't help but think about how it sounds. So yeah, sort of my work is historically based. People have been interested in this. It's not just me going off on one. And then finally, sound and art now. And I think this is very interesting for me, and I think particularly useful for today's sort of themes and topic. And I think from what we've seen this morning, the multisensory is entering into gallery spaces more and more frequently. I think that's great. As we were saying this morning, I think people can connect to it. I think it's very accessible for people. And there has been a real uptake in these kind of exhibitions. So a couple of examples here. In 2015, the National Gallery created a soundscapes exhibition, which I have a problem with the title because to me, it's not accurate, in which they got sort of sound artists to create I would call them sound pieces, quite musical in some instances, in response to, I think it was either 6 or 8 artworks within the collection, one of which was Holbein's The Ambassadors. And I think in reviewed terms, it went down quite well. The issue I have with it is that it was sort of a musical interlude. It's not really thinking about soundscapes in the way my work is thinking about them, but I'm biased. So, yeah. A better example, I think, is, and this is fascinating, in Amsterdam in 2012, they used that painting, which is George Hendrik Breitner's painting, View on the Dam, as inspiration for a soundscape. And the way they did it, because soundscapes are so difficult to get into a museum setting, the way they did it was incredibly thorough. So I think they sent out this guy who specialised in sound studies to the Dam Square sort of very early in the morning, sort of like 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning before people are up. It's very, very quiet, very empty. And he was holding a balloon that he was then released into the square space. And I think there was a policeman there, and he was like, what are you doing? This is really strange. And he was like, no, I'm just recording the space. Because this is a real space and one that still sort of exists very much as it's sort of painted in that image, they wanted to make the sound actually as realistic as possible. And they used this balloon to capture how the sound interacted with the space. Sound does interact with space. It bounces off walls, it ricochets, and that's what they wanted to capture. So it wasn't as simple as going, oh, there's a tram in that painting, and there are some people. Let's make those sounds and then put this into, something people can listen to. No, they wanted to get it bang on. So they wanted to think about how the sound interacts with the space and all those kind of things, which I think is what makes it such an interesting case study to think about, because they're taking it so seriously. And I think that's what it demands. It would be very easy, for example, for the exhibition that I did, to sort of just be like, these are the sounds of a thunderstorm. Whereas what I would like to do is, this is the sound of a thunderstorm over the Lake of Thun at the time of year that Turner was there, because that's all going to impact on what it actually sounds like. Because these are sounds of a particular time and a particular place that I'm really interested in. And it's probably a little bit intense, but it's kind of how I work. I think a downside of this exhibition is, and this is another issue with incorporating sounds into museum spaces, is how do you get them into the space? Do you choose to have them played through just audio speakers within the exhibition space, in which case everyone can hear them, you cannot opt out of it, it's just there. Then there's thinking about how you actually get this sound across. Do you do it from one space, or do you do it from sort of numerous spaces? The ideal is sort of 8 speakers in a room, so you feel like you're enveloped by the sound. Do you necessarily want to do that? It's up to you. So they sort of had it in a little computer screen, sort of just in front of the artwork. In terms of getting people round museum spaces, that's blocking up a lot of the pathways that people are going to be using to see the artworks. It's taking up a lot of space. It's a bit cumbersome. So there are issues in sort of how we get these soundscapes into the museum space, especially as well, you know, museums and galleries are often considered havens of peace and quiet. You're not meant to raise your voice in a museum space. So how are people going to react to suddenly, I don't know, introducing a noisy soundscape into them? Yeah, it's so tricky, and I think about it so much. It's a proper obsession at this point. And then outside gallery spaces as well, people have started to use geolocation, which I think is really interesting. And they did something really good with this in York cemeteries, where they sort of had people record the names, birth dates and death dates of all the people buried in York Cemetery. But there are also lots of unmarked graves in York Cemetery. So as you walked round the space, depending on where you were in the graveyard, the volume and number of voices you would hear as you walked through the space would fluctuate depending on sort of where you were. Like if you were walking over sort of a mass grave, the sound's going to be, you know, considerably louder, a lot more sort of cacophonous, a lot more voices you can hear. And then sort of as you move through the space, you might go into a slightly quieter bit. And that's going to make you think about sort of issues of, well, this is a mass grave. We don't necessarily know who's buried here. What does this tell us about that period in history? What does that tell us about the class of people buried here? All these kind of things come up when thinking about this. I think potentially geolocation could be used in gallery spaces to some degree, sort of as you move around the space. I don't know enough about the technicalities of it at the moment. But I think there are lots of sort of exciting ways to take sound studies, and I think introducing the sound into the space is definitely one way, as is sort of thinking about it in this imaginative way that I've used in the exhibition upstairs. So, yeah, there's a lot to take in, a lot for me to think about, a lot for me to write about for the thesis, which is great. But yeah, thank you so much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed.